Thanks for listening to the Northwest Yearly Meeting podcast. We hope that you find the conversations to be helpful and enlightening as you get to hear from those involved in the Evangelical Friends movement. Be sure to subscribe to the show so you don't miss when a new episode comes out. Thanks, and enjoy the show. All right, well, hello everybody and Merry Christmas. This is the December episode of the Northwest Yearly Meeting podcast, so it's officially Christmas time. Get your cozy sweater on and your cup of hot chocolate and sit by the fireplace and listen to this episode and just enjoy. We're not going to be really talking about Christmassy things, but it's the Christmas season. I'm a big Christmas guy myself, and so I'm excited for Christmas.
I'm so ready for Christmas cookies and all of the holiday stuff. Christmas music, Christmas trees, the whole shebang.
I know.
I'm full on holiday mode.
I started music a little earlier this year than I normally do. I'm not like the super curmudgeon that's like no music until after Thanksgiving, but I try to also not be the person who like pushes play on Christmas right the day after Halloween. I'm like, I want a little balance there, but I think it was like just a week later after Halloween that there was like a new Christmas album or something on the top of Spotify one week, and I was like, you know what, why not just go ahead. So I've been periodically listening to it, like not 100%, but you know, now when December's here, it's 100% all the time Christmas music until Christmas Day.
Well, I don't know what the weather is like been for you, but here in like Salem, mid Willamette Valley area, it was like summer all the way through September to October. And then it was like 80 degrees in October. It was so hot. And then it was like, and then we had like Halloween, and then it was like winter. Like winter came in like early November, and like it's been super cold and wet, and so like I'm like in Christmas mode now because I'm like, whew, it's just been cold for a long time.
It was kind of the same for us. I think I don't remember exactly, but somewhere around whatever day I started listening to Christmas music, it was the same. It had been warm, even in through October, warm. And then like once it got cold, like 3 days later, it snowed. I mean, it wasn't a ton of snow. It didn't really stick throughout the day. But when I woke up and it was snowing, I was like, all right, I guess it's okay to put on some Christmas music. We got a guest today. Oh, well, we have a guest all the time, but our guest today is Alan Weinacht. I'm sure many of you are familiar with him. So I'm going to go ahead and bring him in here. And we will have a conversation with him. Can you hear us, Alan?
Yes.
All right.
Well, Alan, awesome. We're so thrilled to have you join our podcast this month. And I know that there's a lot of people who know you, who are listening to our podcast and are regular listeners. But for those who don't know you very well, could you please just introduce yourself about who you are and kind of your role in Northwest Yearly Meeting?
Sure. My name is Alan Weinacht. Now, that's a very German name. You don't have to get it right. I'll still answer if you call me. And I've been in Northwest Yearly Meeting since 2005. And I came here to be the pastor at Greenleaf Friends Church. I wrapped up my time as pastor here after 17 years and my 40 years in full-time pastoral leadership this past June, and had planned to pick up part-time work, not anticipating that would transition into my becoming the associate superintendent of Northwest Yearly Meeting, which I began just in October. So I'm kind of freshly minted in this job here.
For sure.
Well, yeah. And well, I'm excited to have you here. I don't know you super well, but over the last few years, I've kind of got to rub shoulders with you and have a few conversations. And one of the reasons why we're bringing you here today is though that you're not an expert. You have been a Friends pastor for decades, and we were recently having a discussion about the idea of living authentically or living truthfully. And I thought it was a fantastic conversation. It was one of the reasons why, I wanted to bring you on here this month on the podcast, though I definitely know that there were other things that we talked about. I mean, and hopefully we'll have you on again in the future. But it's this idea of living authentically that I think is so a part of our cultural zeitgeist at the moment. And it's kind of one of those topics that I think are really shaping the spiritual lives of people, especially in the West. And I think it's something that's happening largely subconsciously. I don't even think that it's like something that people are just super aware of. I just think it's like kind of the milieu that we find ourselves in. And as I was kind of preparing for this conversation, I stumbled upon this op-ed by Tara Isabel Burton, and she's a author of an upcoming book called Self-Made. And it kind of focuses on kind of our current moment and our obsession with personal branding, and its kind of history from where it began to now. And in her op-ed, she really kind of nailed something. She put to word something that I've been feeling for a long time and really expressed it. And I think really hit the nail on the head as what it talks about, kind of this change in our culture about what it means to live authentically. And I wanted to kind of start our conversation with this quote, because I believe that there's this new kind of hyper form of individualism that's really kind of an emerging ideology that's really kind of shaping our lives. And this is the quote. According to this newly prevalent gospel of self-actualization, the pursuit of private happiness has increasingly become culturally celebrated as the ultimate goal. The authentic self, to use another common buzzword, is characterized by personal desires and individual longings. Conversely, obligations, including obligations to imperfect and often downright difficult people, are often framed as merely unpleasant circumstance inimical to the solitary pursuit of our best lives. Feelings have become the ultimate authoritative guide to what we ought to do, at the expense of our sense of communal obligations. And specifically, it was the last line. It was, feelings have become the authoritative guide to what we ought to do, at the expense of our sense of our communal obligations. And as a pastor, I'm sure that you've thought about this, and Jacob, you've thought about this, Jacob, working with young people. What do you think, as pastors, what do you think that living authentically means to you, and how do you think that differs from the wider world?
Are you going to solve that in a minute, Jacob?
Maybe two.
Okay.
Maybe two. Yeah. Yeah. I think when I think about that and looking at some of these other questions that we'll bring up later, the first thing that comes to me, the gut thing, like when you talk about being authentic and what does it mean to be authentically you, and being truthful to yourself and things like that, I always think of, or what comes to mind is like, I mean, you see it in real life too, but I think I see it in like movies and TV shows and things like that too. The negative extreme of that or whatever is just being like really brash and brazen and rude, and being like, well, if people don't like me, that's their problem. This is just me. I'm just being myself. I'm just being authentic, like kind of the idea of like throwing off the social graces of like being proper, and I don't know, just being like, this is me. If you don't like me, then whatever, see ya. You don't need to be around me, that kind of stuff. And so yeah, there's this, I don't know what the difference is, on one sense, sure, I guess if you are a rude jerk all the time, then that is you being authentic. But is that where you want to just live for the rest of your life, just accepting that that's how you're going to behave and act? I would hope the answer would be no. So I think there is this tension of being like, yes, this is me, this is where I'm at right now, but also being like, we can always strive to better ourselves, we can always improve things. So just because this is my authentic self today doesn't mean that this should be where I am for the next 80 years.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I really appreciate you reading that quote describing our time. And, I just have really been caught lately thinking about this kind of stuff. And I spent some time thinking, what other words would I use synonyms of authenticity. And these are the ones that come to my mind. One would be integrity. Another would be consistency, a life that's integrated and complete, that you've thought life through and there's a wholeness to it. That to me, that's getting off in the direction of authenticity. And Jacob, I think it's really funny that we're sitting here right now. I've just been speaking at Meridian Friends for the last 2 weeks, and we'll be again this Sunday because their pastor, Ken Redford, has been leading a trip to Egypt and Israel. But we've been drawn from First Peter, and I think Peter really speaks to how we live an integrated life. And you can really look at that, and he's concerned about how do we live an authentic Christian life, even when the world is looking at Christians and saying, you guys are out to lunch, and are speaking derisively toward it. And what's really stood out to me is he begins with who we are in the Lord as a holy people, and then moves on to what it means to be a living witness, that we live out that faith. And then he comes to a fantastic word in chapter 2 where he says, keep your conduct among the Gentiles honorable. And I thought, now there's a biblical sense of authenticity, that a life is lived in this world honorably in a way that it's in alignment with the holiness of God. I think there is where Christianity goes. And in reality, that has nothing to do with feelings. That has everything to do with what we were created to be in the first place, and God's design, which speaks of why we're so out of sync with the world, because more and more our world functions like we've got to figure it out. And that's where that authenticity that you were reading, that quote that was summarizing our culture, is coming from, isn't it, Austin? We're obligated to figure this thing out.
Well, I think you brought up two things that I think that there's this, these different definitions between what it means to be living authentic. I do think that there's this sense that, and I think that the quote kind of summarizes this, what I would say is kind of a general cultural understanding that being authentic just means, pursuing my own personal desires and longings, whatever they are, over and above obligations to people, to communities, and where even just the self is formed is just this kind of like how I feel about myself, and seeing this, like where is my identity and who forms it, and how a lot of the times it's totally self-derived. That it's my feelings about myself and my opinions about myself, and that's where I get my identity, rather than having our identity formed by kind of what I would consider external sources, where historically, our identities were shaped by things totally out of our control, like where you lived, like what nation you were born in, the family you belonged to. They all kind of became, your identity. Like I think of, it wasn't too long ago that if you were born to a certain kind of family, like a farming family or a banking family, or, you would take the career of your father or your mother, and you would just kind of, that would be your identity. And it was just kind of given to you. And one of the things that I think that's interesting about just kind of what you quoted is how, coming from a Christian tradition, there's a sense that our identities are given to us by God, and that in living in authenticity or integrity is to move in that direction by living a life according to that identity that God gave us, rather than like what we feel. And it is something that is kind of an interesting difference between these two kind of like paradigms that we have of, there's a, like, I think of the story of the Israelites, like God's chosen people, that he chose them, gave them this identity because of his choosing. He chose Israel, and as a result, like they had certain responsibilities and they had to live into their identity apart versus, this is who I am and the rest of the world conform to me. And it's kind of just an interesting difference, that I don't know how many times people are like consciously thinking about, like, am I like living authentically to my feelings or to, this any other sort of like standard? Like what is the guide that is guiding my identity? Because we do definitely, I think, have choices of what is our ultimate guide here.
As you say that, one of the things that comes to my mind is that I think from a biblical point of view, what's going to be the telltale mark, I think of Jesus referring to the true and the false prophets. By their fruit you will know them. And that's what we have biblically, is what are the results? What's the fruit coming out of people's lives? And there's very much a sense in Jesus' teaching on into the New Testament letters. For example, Jesus talking about abiding in me, that picture of the vine and the branches in John chapter 15, that abiding in Christ, your life will bear fruit and it will speak for itself, before a watching world. And I think as the more I sit with this idea of what's authentic, I think the biblical perspective is we live that life that the Lord has called us to do, and it produces exactly the product that people need and want, and that is good not just for us as individuals, but is good for society. And so it's very much not just me centered, it's corporately centered, it's the good of the whole centered. But I just think of the fruit of the Spirit in Galatians. There's no sense that we have to manufacture that.
Mm-hmm.
Rather, it's the product of us walking intentionally in the Lord, and that's something we really want to take note of in conversations about authenticity. And we begin with the design that the Lord has, is that it actually produces exactly what people would want in their lives and what society needs.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I wonder, thinking about that a little bit more, Alan, like when you mentioned the fruit of the Spirit, so like joy and peace and patience, all that kind of stuff. So, I guess my question is, I'm sure all of us have harder times with some of those more than other people or whatever. But for example, like, let's just say you are not generally good with patience. Another way to put it, I guess, you're not authentically a patient person. And you talk about like living into that. So in a way, you could kind of be like, I guess the extreme negative way to be like, well, that you're not being authentic. You're just being fake. Like, you're not really being patient. You're just putting that on to be whatever. But I guess that in a way is maybe how you learn to become more patient, right? I don't know. And like I said, maybe some of us are better at some of those things than other. Like some people, you might know someone who genuinely is a patient person from day one. I don't know. But I'm sure we all struggle with some of those things of the fruits of the Spirit more than others. But that's kind of going back to my point. Like, we don't just want to throw our hands up and say, well, that's just being me. I'm not a patient person.
Mm-hmm.
It's not that we're being fake when we're like trying to be better at those things, because that's not, quote unquote, our authentic nature. But we want to live into that to be more like Christ. So I think that might be some of the struggle from culture, is like, you're being fake, you're not being real. And it's like, well, yeah, I'm not actually always this patient with people. It is kind of something that I have to work at and put on. But I don't know. That's not a bad thing, I guess, to try to work at these things.
And I think, Jacob, you're getting at something about kind of where our identities are formed. Like, our identity is just like baked into us from the very beginning, and that's just who we are. Like, we are genetically programmed to be X, Y, or Z. Like when Jacob, you were born, like you're and to kind of using kind of an analogy that speaks to our time, is like like, you got your software here, right? And so you're just running your software, and to deviate from that, to ask you to change is actually like harmful, because like, so like what we just need to do is just like accept Jacob for who he is and just like let him be, right? But I think what's interesting to me is that the Bible, I think, shows us a different picture of, that the kind of the meta narrative around scripture is, like God created humanity to be a certain thing, Adam and Eve in the garden to be this royal priesthood that worked and partnered with God to bring out life and flourishing and goodness, to fill the earth and be super abundant. And then, sin entered the world. We decided that we wanted to do our own thing, and we didn't want to do what God said. And as such, like death and pain and sickness and a whole bunch of other tragedies like emerged in our world, and that we are like living with. And how kind of the Christian story is that God is intervening in that to bring us back to Eden, to bring us back to the place where we can be the image bearers that God originally intended us to be, what our real identity is, and that we have kind of this like this false self aligned with like in us, as long as with our like real selves. Or what I would probably would better be say this, like God's intention for us, and then our own selves are kind of like battling each other. And I think what's so interesting about this kind of these two different, I don't know, worldviews is how that like plays out, and how then we live out in the world. I think one thing that you talked about, living authentically, if like you're not just a preternaturally patient person, then is, striving to be more patient, going against who you really are. One of the things, because you don't feel like you're a really patient person, but something that I think is so interesting about just virtue in general is that virtues don't really come naturally to anybody. I think the opposite is true, that we often are more inclined to our vices than to our virtues, and that we have to develop our better natures. And I would say it's really the Spirit that like cultivates that in us, that we have to kind of strive against our false self, our sinful nature, to go towards what God intended us to be. That there is a sinless version of Jacob that exists in God's mind, that he wants to see in the world, and that we can strive towards working in tandem with the Spirit towards that direction. That in some ways, as I'm just kind of like spitballing here, I haven't really formulated this thought, is that like part of sanctification, if we want to use like a Christian term, or this like the process in becoming more like Jesus, is that we are conforming ourselves to the image of Jesus, and that is really where our true selves need to aim towards, and is the ultimate goal, rather than just following my base desires. And that one is this true self in a sense, and one is a false self in a sense.
I think one of the things that's getting pointed out here is that if you look at the trajectory of Western culture right now, and biblical worldview, biblical orientation, they really are going in different directions, and we are not going, by the sake of argument, going to convince anybody that our way is better. I just don't think we're going to out argue it. We're not going to debate it. Really, I think the New Testament perspective, as it reached out into the non-Jewish world and was getting integrated into that Greco-Roman world, is the believers were going to have to learn how to live it, how to be patient, and just like Jesus said to his disciples, calling them to be a loving community, he said, they'll know you're my disciples by the love you have for one another. In other words, our lives have to speak. And it may be that we just have to very patiently let our lives speak until somebody who's gone down the trail that Jacob was describing, I'm just not naturally a patient person. Therefore, I'm going to give myself to authentically be be the person who's impatient. You know, the way God works in people's lives is by and large, he lets them go that direction and they hit the wall. And then someday somebody's going to look at one of us who's really been allowing that fruit of the spirit to be born in our lives. They're going to look at us and say, how did you get there? But for the reality is, most of us are pretty stubborn when it comes to learning, and we usually want to hit our heads against the wall a number of times. But yet what people need is a place to look at and say, how did you get there? How did you do that? And I think that's why we just have to keep living authentic lives, being shaped in the Lord with that biblical sense of authenticity. It doesn't mean we're going to make everybody happy. We may not make anybody happy, that's looking off from the outside. We're just supposed to do it because that's what the Lord called us to be, and let it speak for itself and be that open door then when it begins to be a part of how other people awaken and say, I'm sick of hitting the wall. That, this is where Dallas Willard, who was a huge voice in spiritual formation in the latter part of the 20th century and coming into the 21st here, talked about why, as Christians, we desperately need to rediscover the spiritual disciplines, because these are the practices that integrate life. We don't just set out to become a more patient person.
Yeah.
What we do is we discipline ourselves, and there's traditional disciplines that have been known and identified for centuries upon centuries. There may be refinements of those that we discover really work for us as individuals, but those are the disciplines are where we begin to integrate the fact that we are spiritual beings in human bodies, and in those disciplines, we start bringing those together. And those disciplines are where we engage with the formative work of the Lord in our lives. So basic disciplines like study, like prayer, places where we dwell deeply with the Lord, fasting, service, where in serving others, we learn a humility and a letting go of ourselves. And do we ever learn patience in serving? That is a natural product of servanthood. And so we're shaped, those virtues are shaped in our lives. And Dallas Willard would say that's why we're paying a huge price for not practicing the disciplines. We wind up with this disconnect of needing to have like the fruit of the spirit, but yet we don't have a way to get there. We just say, oh, I'm going to become more patient. Well, that's a loser. You know what I mean? Because we're doing it on our own rather than be shaped by God present with us, working in us, and the disciplines open up those doors. So I thought that we're saying, and that's a whole nother podcast if we want to tackle that one sometime, about why would we do disciplines. But yet I think it was worth mentioning here. They're what opened the door up for the kind of spiritual formation that creates it in us and gives, allows this authenticity to be shaped.
That kind of really, to kind of segue the conversation just a bit, because I know that when in here that there's kind of this, I would call these two different paradigms. Kind of the way I've thought about this is kind of like living truthfully versus, living authentically, like living into the truth of who God thinks we are and who he wants us to be. And, and integrating that into our lives versus, this cultural sense of, I just got to be authentic. I got to be real. There's kind of a difference there. And historically, this is something that as friends, this is something that is a part of our tradition, actually, that in that for friends, historically, living truthfully has been super important to our spiritual lives, and to our witness, that they were very much connected, that it was very imperative for early friends to live truthfully, even at the cost of themselves. And this was rooted in scripture, based on several passages. I mean, truth is as an idea in scripture is like all over the place, but few things are, Jesus's commandment to let your yes be yes and your no be no. Paul's commandment to the Ephesians to put away all falsehood. Even the ninth commandment to not bear false witness, all kind of testify this urging to live honest, truthful lives. And this conviction kind of manifests itself several times over the history of Friends. Kind of some examples being early Friends refused to use titles for people, that they were in a very socially hierarchical system, and class titles were really important, and they refused to use class titles because they felt like it was dishonest, that it said that some people were more important than others because of just the fact that they were born to a different family or in some other cases was fair business deals, like setting a set price for goods, for example, rather than having two prices for different kinds of people. Or even just and Quakers even took and Friends took very seriously not swearing oaths. And so even in America, there's a practice where you can swear or affirm in a court of law, for example. And this made Friends fairly unique among different Christian groups, especially in England and America. And it was a way for us to, this kind of parlance was a way to get at this reality of being authentic, being truthful, being integrated. And so Alan, since you've been around the block for a while, more so than I have, because I haven't been a pastor all that long, do you think the Friends Church has done a good job recently upholding this tradition, to living into being truthful, and maybe why or why not?
Well, I think that's a challenging question, because it may take some history and hindsight, you know what I mean, to know how well. But I know, like in membership classes, those are the kinds of things we talk about, and integrity of speech and those values and things like that. An example, this is really simple, but I love this snapshot of an example. This would have happened back, I think, in late 80s, early 1990s. And it happened to me where I was pastoring at Little Blue River Friends Church back in Indiana. You're the meeting. And I was in town one day at the bank. It was not a big town, maybe 3,000 people, something like that when we lived there. And as I was standing in line, the bank manager was walking through the lobby. And I'd never really talked to this guy before. I mean, I recognized him. And he stopped me and he said, "You're the pastor out at Little Blue River Friends Church, aren't you?" And I said, "Yeah." And you begin to wonder where this is going. And he said to me, "Now, such and such family are members of your church, right?" And I said, "Yeah." And you begin to wonder where this is going. And he said, this just blew me away. He said, "I would trust my bank to those people." And I walked out saying, wow. Now there was a Friends family, and they had been in that church since its founding. I said I was probably around 1990 when this happened. The church was founded in the 1830s, and that family lineage had been in the church at the founding. And that is a significant reputation in a community. So I don't know if it's written in giant ways. That's a really good question. But boy, as a pastor, I've had some of those experiences, like that of my people's integrity standing out. There's an authenticity there that counted when a banker could walk through and say that about members of a Friends church. I think we've tried to do that in terms of like our Bible schools, and our colleges have tried to keep an integrated sense of a biblical worldview and integrating life. I think we've worked at that and have really produced quality people. That one kind of comes to mind. So as far as contemporary, those are just some right off the top of my head thoughts.
Yeah. Thanks for that. Yeah. I know for me, as kind of like as a Friends pastor who's, I've been doing this for a little bit, it hasn't actually been I think the idea of living integrated and being against hypocrisy is kind of been in the forefront of my mind, but also just living truthfully into the way of orienting my lives to conform to what I think the base reality is. Has, I would say, would be like kind of a deeper level here of like truth as what is the reality of, of who God is, who I am, and how does that permeate into like every crevice of my life has not been honestly like on the top of my mind. And as I was kind of like preparing for our podcast, I was like, man, like I was thinking about this and I was like, it hasn't really been like up there in my consciousness of like, how do I live truthfully like today? Because I'll kind of use the example of, like plain speech, right? So for those who aren't familiar, plain speech was a way of a particular way of friends speaking, that they used these and thous back then, because it was in some ways less formal, and more intimate, because the pronoun you was kind of used in the we forms, kind of delineated between class, and they were really against seeing people in different class structures, that they were like essentially all human beings are equal before God, and so we're recognizing the inherent worth in everybody by using kind of this more familiar language. It's kind of this like example of that they brought this, this theological conviction about, how humanity is, and living it out in a very particular way is something that I just think is interesting. That it was something that I haven't really thought much about, even though I know that that's kind of in the history of Friends. And I wonder, in this cultural moment that's so obsessed with living authentically, how living truthfully might be a way to, live differently in the world. That kind of reflects the way Quakers have always been different in the world, at least from historical examples.
Yeah.
Right.
I don't mean this necessarily in a negative sense, but I'm just thinking, you use the example too, and for Friends history, like other companies and stuff would kind of use the Quaker name, in the sense of, like knowing that Quakers were known for being honest and giving a fair price and whatever. So some companies that that have the Quaker name attached to them are really had nothing to do with the Quakers or the Friends Church. They were just using that for name recognition to,
like oats.
Yeah, different things like that. I'm not sure all of them, but so apparently the Quakers had such a reputation and were known for that back in the day, that other non-religious and non-Quaker affiliated things were kind of trying to associate with them. I'm not so sure that that's happening today. And so I just wonder, is that what would, I'm not sure that that's happening with any Christian organization today, not just Quakers, but so that's an interesting thing to think of. Way back in the day, whenever that was, we did have such a good reputation that other people wanted to kind of jump onto our bandwagon. And now it seems like not only does no one want to jump on the bandwagon, but they also kind of vilify maybe and throw stones at the bandwagon. So I don't know, I'm not necessarily saying that that's a mark against us to say, well, we must not be doing a good job if nobody wants to associate with us, but it is just an interesting thing to kind of look at.
Well, I think an important thing to add to that, Jacob, is that I don't think historically you could look at any particular friend and say we're out to make a name for ourselves, and that someday somebody will put it on a box of Quaker oats. You know what I mean?
Definitely.
We're trying to live authentic lives, and in hindsight, people recognized it. I think that's part of the power of it. A really good example I think of is John Woolman. and I'd like to just I wanted to mention him today. He lived from 1720 to 1772, and John Woolman, in a profound way, spoke to the issue of slavery in colonial America. And his story begins with, he was working in a store and was asked to, be the witness to the sale of a slave. So from one person to another. And the selling of a human being cut him to the heart. And that set him on a trajectory of the rest of his life dealing with this issue of slavery. And the way he went about working was just incredible. He got permission of his monthly meeting to travel and begin to talk with friends up and down the East Coast. He was in what's now New Jersey, and his journal just checks out, follows his travels, and he comments, and he mentions in there over and over again. I've got my journal all marked up and notes taken, about how he dealt with that issue. And one of the beautiful things is he would sit down in the home of slave owners and talk with them, not just about how it was hurting the slaves, but about how it was hurting them and how it was hurting their children, corrupting their view of our perspectives on our fellow man, and grew quite a reputation. And I don't think he ever set out to have our name on a bill box, but he was just really trying to think that through authentically. And one of the things that really caught me off guard was, this would have been probably back sometime in the 1980s, late 80s. We were in Washington, D.C., and we were in the National Archives, and in the room where you have, the Declaration of Independence, there's a copy of the Magna Carta, and those documents. There was, I think it was a display that had rotating letters or rotating documents from American history. There was a letter signed by Quakers, and who signed along with them was Benjamin Franklin, urging the Continental Congress to get rid of slavery at the founding of the nation. And they predicted that it would split the nation. It was a stunning letter. I'm standing in the National Archives reading this letter out of our tradition, and thought, wow, look at the impact that Woolman, quietly traveling up and down the East Coast, visiting with people, going to monthly meetings, speaking up, had on friends who were, trying to be good to slaves, but still owning slaves. And he had the courage to say, this is out of sync. He never set out to make a name, but did he ever make a name?
Yeah.
I think that's living a life that strives with authenticity without a super goal in mind. He's doing it because it was the right thing to do.
Well, and just to kind of, if you have never read John Woolman's journal, you definitely should get your hands on a copy. I don't know if it's one of those books that is still being printed like on a mass scale, but there you can definitely find copies online. I've read it. When I was becoming a friend, it was one of those books that I read, partially as to kind of get an idea of what the Friends were about. The Friends' practice of journals there's just a lot of journals. And it's funny because John Woolman's journal itself is kind of boring, in the sense of it's often just him going like, I went to this monthly meeting, or I went and spoke with this person. But in all of the kind of the boring travelogue stuff, there'll be these brilliant flashes of, you're like, wow, like that's where he'll be like, yeah, I felt moved to, because at this time Quakers did own slaves. This is like John Woolman wasn't ministering to the rest of the world in the sense that he wasn't, going on like speaking circles to talking to just random people in cities about slavery. He was like talking specifically very much to Quakers to like have them stop to discontinuing the use of slavery because he felt it was incongruent with the faith, that he was kind of calling the church to be more integrated as such, to live more truthfully into the spirit of God, and not because he was like having this like social justice banner, but like really the kind of the word that he uses out of emotion of love of people,
Right.
and just both slaveholder and the slave. It was to create reconciliation and unity and a proper economic life. And he like totally reorganizes his life to do this. It's quite remarkable, but it integrated these, these principles of, trying to speak truthfully, because he never shied away from the difficult conversations, even though he wasn't a jerk about it.
No.
And he often talks about what great pains it took him to be like, I need to talk about this and I really don't want to. And so if you really want to like have like I would recommend this to any Christian or any person really who's interested in this conversation, to read this book. It's fabulous. But I warn you, it's a tad boring at parts. But it also feels so relevant and contemporary today, even when I read it. If you can get past some of the language issues, because Friends speak in a funny way back then, where they use things like, instead of saying January, they say first month. But if you can kind of get past some of that, it's excellent. So kind of to end our conversation, and this is just going to be kind of my last question, to just think about as a spiritual practice, what are ways that you think that people can live more truthfully or authentic today? Like what are some things that we can, move in that direction, and not necessarily be truthful in the sense of I just want to do what I want to do, but living into the reality of God and the people that God wants us to be.
I think I'll address that by ending with a story. To me, it was kind of a John Woolman kind of moment in my life. And I'll tell this really fast. When we still lived in Indiana, actually, for 5 years, I was the general superintendent of Indiana Yearly Meeting. And in that period when I was the general superintendent, some legislation came up in the Indiana State House to legalize pari-mutuel gambling. So gambling, lottery and all that was really on the rise. And Indiana was feeling the pressure because we didn't have riverboat gambling like Ohio did down on the Ohio River and all that kind of stuff.
Wait,
so there's a real pressure to not lose that money.
Riverboat gambling? I'm just oh, sorry. I digress. I'm really fascinated about that.
It's a southern Midwest thing. I know what it is.
Never heard of this.
Oh yeah, it's there.
Oh yeah.
Okay, sorry.
So at any rate, I was asked to speak as a part of a group at a state house rally up in Indianapolis and represent religion, not just Christianity, but I had like a 3 to 4 minute speech at this rally on why would religion, speak out against gambling. And there were other people doing other perspectives like economic and, things like that. Well, I started looking at friends' perspectives, non-friends' perspectives, even picked up on disapproval of gambling out of a book on a new history of India and perspectives on gambling out of ancient Indian culture over in the country of India. Anyway, one of the things that really stood out to me was that it's like gambling is like so many other things. There is a percentage of people that once they become addicts. So somewhere 7-8%, something like that, become compulsive gamblers. And it takes them in a very destructive direction. And the John Woolman moment for me was kind of like, wait, when we approve things that socially, culturally, we approve them, and we can predict a percentage are going to become addicts and it's destructive in their life. Should we not, for the sake of loving our neighbors, just say no socially? Do we really need to do that? Can I live without gambling? Yes. If it's approved, is it going to impact my life? No, because I'm not a gambler. I just don't go that direction. But should I stand speak because I know if we took a random 100 people, any 6 of them would become compulsive gamblers? Should I not speak out? Not because I've got this big legalistic thing, but simply because of I love my neighbor as myself. And I would prefer not live in a society that set people up for addictions. And it was just that simple. But I think that's kind of going in that direction of John Woolman. Like, are we counting total cost? And what is a responsible way to believe and behave so that we love our neighbor and not just take care of ourselves? And I think that's a huge piece of authenticity with what emerges out of Christianity. So I'll just kind of end with that. I think that speaks to the kinds of things we need to be thinking about in our day.
Jacob,
Yeah.
do you have any thoughts?
I do. I mean, kind of along the same thing. One that has been personally convicting to me for a long time, is in a similar vein, is the death penalty, and
Mhm.
being against the death penalty. You know, we talk a lot about, as Christians, being pro-life, and a lot of times when people speak about that, they're speaking about babies and unborn babies, which is understandable because that's what the conversation is about a lot. But when you really think about that, and I've read this great book on it that was called like The Whole Life. It's like, you know, moving away from pro-life, because really when people say that, that's kind of just a veiled way of talking about babies. But, you know, to say as a Christian, we need to be proponents of a whole life view. So yes, also still being champions of babies and unborn babies, but also people in nursing homes who are being treated poorly, people who are on death penalty, on death row, things like that. Like, from birth to death, we are champions of someone's whole life, not just forgetting about them once they're born. And I think that's another authentic thing, you know, is like, on one hand, we're championing one thing, getting a baby to be born, but then when you also cheer someone who, you know, fully admit has done some horrific things. Like, I think of the example just recently, this high school kid who did that shooting at the high school in Parkland, Florida, or whatever. His trial just happened like a week or two ago, I believe, and he just got life in prison. The judge, you know, gave him like 12 counts of life in prison, you know, however they worked that out. But a lot of people were upset that he didn't get the death penalty. And, you know, I see a lot of things online, like he should have been put to death for what he did. And I'm just like, kind of like what Alan's saying, is that good for society? Is that good for us as followers of Christ to be championing for the death of somebody else? So yeah, I think that's one for me that's kind of convicting, and it can get emotional. It can be a controversial topic because, you know, people will be like, well, are you supporting what he did? Obviously not, but yeah, it can be an emotional conversation.
Yeah, I mean, for me, I mean, those are two examples. I know for me, I think right now, because it's been election season, you know, these kind of bigger social issues are in our consciousness a lot more, at least I should say, myself speaking, I definitely I think about those kind of social issues a lot more, especially this time where, you know, we get a vote on a lot of these sorts of things. But as I've been thinking about my own, just like, what does it mean to live more truthfully? I honestly haven't come up with a good, like, if I'm being honest here, I haven't really come to a conclusion yet of like, these would be the practices I would start doing, which I guess is probably a little bit of a letdown. But it's been something that I've just started kind of thinking about more readily. How can I be more truthful to, like, and I'll give, maybe this is an example. I know as a pastor, I tend not to like lead with that with people, especially if I don't know them. I don't know if you've ever had this experience, but as soon as once people know that I'm a pastor, they get all weird around me. they like,
Oh, you've noticed, huh?
yeah, it's a very funny thing. People will start like getting cagey around me, or they'll treat me like I'm extra holy, or like I have like a special phone that reaches God. And I know for something that I've done, so I don't typically lead with that, but something that I also do is I just ask people just to use my name rather than my title. Because it's kind of one of those things where it's just like, I don't want to deceive my own self thinking that like, because other people are reacting to this title, that like I'm somehow more different. I also think that reading scripture has been helpful in understanding just like human nature and human condition. There was kind of, and this is going to sound maybe kind of dark, but I'm not trying to be like negative here. And this isn't any way to like make people feel bad about themselves. But I read, it was last year I was reading an article about why it's a good thing to label ourselves sinners as a part of our like identity. And I thought that it was a really compelling piece about how like we have to acknowledge the fact that we fail to miss the mark repeatedly, and that we come to God with this like an understanding that we are broken and limited, and it can help us, move us forward. And I'm not really doing I'm not doing the piece justice, but it came out in Lent, and it was fabulous. And maybe I can add it in the show notes or something. But it was a way to say, like recognizing my condition as a sinner as a truthful statement of like the human condition can help us then, battle or address these shortcomings that are spiritual in nature as well, but also just recognizing that that's just who we are. And anyway, those are some ideas that I had. Well, thank you, Alan, for joining us for this edition of the Northwest Yearly Meeting podcast, and looking forward to having future conversations with you at some point.
Well, thank you. It was good to be here with you, gentlemen, today, and God bless you.
Thank you.
Well, if this podcast has been informative, enlightening, encouraging, please take time to subscribe and review. We really appreciate it. And do we have any other announcements, Jacob?
I don't believe so. Yeah, once again, Merry Christmas, Happy Holidays, enjoy the time, and we'll be back in 2023. That feels weird to say, but 2023.